Healthcare is a huge and growing cost in most developed countries, but the promise of personalized medicine, electronic healthcare records, and generally the fusion of information technology with healthcare technology has the potential to deliver much better outcomes for a fraction of the cost. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute, and in this episode, we are going to try to answer the basic question of what healthcare looks like in a Web3 and blockchain world. To help us with this discussion, I'm joined with Sean Mannion. Sean is the Chief Scientific Officer at Equideum Health. Equidium is a ConsenSys Mesh portfolio company and ConsenSys partner, which builds Web3 person-centered healthcare and research networks called Data Integrity and Learning Networks. Sean is also the co-author of the book Blockchain for Medical Research, Accelerating Trust in Healthcare. Welcome to the podcast, Sean.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for putting out such great content for everyone.
Well, we're going to talk about healthcare today, and I think you are an eminently qualified contributor to this conversation. And I know it's a great passion for you and other people in the industry. We are looking at the intersection of some technology into the healthcare space that has the potential of being very, very impactful. And a lot of us believe that it's kind of long overdue, that healthcare is an incredibly important, but an incredibly expensive component of the economy. And we are always looking for ways of getting better patient outcomes in much more affordable kinds of ways. And so part of the big question is what technology can be brought to bear. I think I'd like to start this conversation with kind of two fundamental questions. Well, let's actually first won't be even a question. I was reading at the Equidium website your mission statement, effectively kind of your raison d'être, and I thought it was actually a very concise way of going to some of the core issues. And it reads that you're out to solve the person-centered healthcare and research network problem to advance health equity and outcomes by optimizing data liquidity across enterprise and individual silos. And there's a bunch of important elements in there, one of which is patient-centered, another one is outcomes and equity, and the other really kind of big idea would be this idea of both data liquidity and trying to break down the silos of data, which I'm supposing represents a fair amount of the inefficiency that we see in the healthcare marketplace, or perhaps a lot of the potential to improve the system and remove some costs.
Indeed. And to put it even more succinctly, we like to say data liquidity and health equity powered by Ethereum, although we view multi-chain future as where we are going. So it really is the case that we understand data locked in silos doesn't really help either create new products, create new knowledge, nor does it help an individual when it comes to personalizing their treatment or their diagnosis. The health and health-related data about you, about me, about everyone is scattered to the winds. It's in a bunch of different places, particularly when you consider that health-related data, things like social determinants data, environmental data, behavioral data, simply doesn't exist in the electronic health record, which is what we're using to make most health decisions. And so really that data liquidity is absolutely critical. And from a health equity standpoint, both in fairness across groups that have been underrepresented in health advances that are continuing to be underrepresented in representation in algorithms for clinical AI that are being created. There's a need to get better equity within the system, but there's also on an individual level a fairness on what of mine is being used for other people's benefit. What of mine from a health perspective should I be compensated for? If it's my health data, if it's my health adjacent data, maybe social determinants data that is going into algorithm training, or what can be brought back to benefit me in a personalized medicine sort of way. Those are the things that we're really focused on, and empowering patients to be part of that so that you create a better system through patient consent, through patient empowerment, and through patient compensation.
So you've touched on a whole bunch of, I think, very important topics there. So let's tease apart a few of those things. We'll start with the the data silo question. I was in a conversation recently with another expert in the Web3 world, and the analogy of the ERP era of the 1980s and 2000s, and the idea that if you had a centralized database and then you strung onto it various different processes, that would give you a lot of advantage in terms of efficiencies and reducing the errors of the boundary conditions between silos and getting greater insight and being more responsive and all that kind of stuff. And the suggestion was that one of the major attributes of blockchain as applied to many different industries is effectively bringing that same silo breaking advantage to not only organizations, but to ecosystems of multiple stakeholders, multiple parties that can, have common views of data and leverage common application functionality, business logic that they have collective confidence in to, interact with that data and then collectively produce better results in the industry or for the marketplace, for patients in this particular case. So, how big a problem is data siloing in the healthcare space?
I think it's huge, and I think it's bigger than most people even realize because we've been so used to the differentiation of data. Let's take a perspective to start with, and my boss and friend Heather Flannery, CEO and founder of Equideum Health, likes to talk about an alien coming to the Earth, and in this case, I'll use a U.S. perspective and say, okay, where is the health data on an individual? Well, the health data on me sits in hospital systems for clinical, sits in perhaps research studies and separate servers for those research studies that I may have been in. And then also sits separately in regulatory areas for things that need to be overseen from a regulatory perspective, and also non-health related data, which isn't even overseen by the same bodies. So you can have replication and differentiation of these silos just across different elements of our system. Then move to just one of those across different hospital systems. They may use different systems themselves, even internal to a system. They may classify the data in different ways. The data sharing can't happen seamlessly across. Classic example, DoD and VA, though it's the same longitudinal population. The Department of Defense has one set of data about individuals. The Veterans Administration has another set of data about the same individuals. And yet the data sharing across there is not possible right now, and has driven a significant amount of investment by the federal government on the nature of $30 billion, that it still has not achieved that goal. And so those silos of healthcare data are immense and then very fractionated all over the place. The challenge with bringing it together in a centralized way is that the data itself is huge. In the 80s, there was a smaller amount of data representationally about me or you than there is now. Whereas now, if you bring imaging data, if you bring all of the types of data about an individual, especially in health, that data has grown so large about a single individual that to consolidate it in a centralized manner is costly, it's inefficient, it's a risk from a hacking perspective. And so it doesn't happen on a scale that really brings us personalized medicine. So between that data siloing and between those impediments to centralizing all the data about an individual, we really haven't achieved even a modicum of personalization of data that we could with the right structures in place.
So it seems to me that there's a bunch of kind of issues that are bundled up there. One of which is that I've heard actually creates quite a bit of cost in the system, which is the question of, what over testing, right? That if you're a clinician or you're interacting with a patient and you need a data point in order to, do a diagnosis or prescribe a therapeutic or whatever it happens to be, that you'll order a test, even though that person might have had that test a week ago at some other place, and your lack of visibility and your lack of access to that data just means that it's cheaper, it's easier at that point to just simply order a new one and just have a lot of redundancy, and that just drives a lot of cost in the system. The other related issue, of course, is that if the data is really siloized, then it's hard to find the correlative patterns that may suggest a particular diagnosis or a particular treatment or therapeutic or prescription that is appropriate in that particular, situation. And then the third piece, going to your observation just about the raw volume of data. Of course, all the various different imaging technologies driving huge, data volumes, as well as the testing. But we even have, the personal IoT, interaction with our lives, that we're wearing devices like this Aura Ring that I'm wearing that has a collection of 5 or 6 sensors in it and measures all kinds of stuff that, I can print it out on a spreadsheet and bring it to my doctor to show my, heart rhythm patterns or my HRV over some period of time. And that can help them. But even that data is siloized because it's on my phone and my doctor doesn't have access to it. So this is a big, broad problem.
It definitely is. And to the first point you made, that clinical the clinical actionability of data is sometimes a question underlying that. If you get one test in one doctor's office and then go to another doctor's office and get that same test, sometimes that's in large part because that second doctor can't trust the provenance of the data that they've got, that may have gotten from the first doctor. If it's data that's given to the patient and there's no clear way of tracking that provenance of data, of showing the data wasn't manipulated by the individual. What if I'm someone addicted to opioids and I'm simply manipulating my data between doctors' offices so I can get another prescription? That type of fear feeds into not wanting to utilize data across hospital systems. But there's also just a fear of being sued. If a clinical decision is made by data that someone didn't have oversight on collection of, that puts the risk, that transfers the risk to that second doctor. And so there's a number of reasons that are rational within our current system why that takes place. But of course, from a broader perspective, the system has an irrationality to it. And fixing that is a broader fix than incremental fixes at any one level. And that's one of the challenges. I like to think of a future where you walk into a clinician's office and with your consent, that clinician can access any necessary information about you with, and this is important, some way of digesting that information. You can't just throw a bunch of raw data at an individual. You would need that clinician to have some sort of trusted way of being able to access all of that data, have it processed for their digestion, and use that to make the right diagnosis or the right treatment for you. That's what truly personalized medicine would be. And to your third point, that includes not just what's in an electronic health record here or in another clinic. That includes what's in your Aura Ring, what's in the apps that you utilize on your phone. We're working with Nokia Bell Labs to try and solve some of those edge device questions, and they're some of the most challenging. How, without constantly sending that information to a centralized repository, can you query that information if you're a doctor who needs to make a decision, or can you use that information for algorithm training if you're developing a new algorithm? That's going to require not only a technology fix, and we have some pieces of that in place. We've got a system for consent, fine-grained consent that allows individuals to approve it for this use and not for this use. But you would need to find a way to have the business processes involved and the regulatory approvals involved for that information to be utilized. But bringing all those things to bear, you can have truly personalized medicine about an individual if you can gain access to all of the data you need about them. It's gaining access to that data, not collecting all that data, but being able to query it and being able to train algorithms against it, sending the compute to the data that will allow us to do that in the data environment that we live.
Yeah, the potential of a patient-centered healthcare system seems to me extremely compelling. That if you look at the dramatic fall in the cost of genomic analysis testing, and the fall in the cost of and the expansion of the capabilities of artificial intelligence, the ability for us to ingest just vast amounts of information and derive extraordinary insight, and then with a combination of genomic information and testing information from increasingly powerful testing machines and testing protocols, combined with the ability to collect data on a regular basis, 24 hours a day from people, that that combination of data points should allow us to be able to target various different, therapeutics and drug therapies and, various different approaches to, solving patient problems in a very, very precise way that right now we just kind of do things, in a relatively, generic sort of way and somewhat, well, I was going to say hope for the best. That's of course is not giving the medical industry nearly enough credit, but the point is that we have some relatively coarse grade tools that in a world where we have patient-centric data available, that changes quite considerably, and the cost associated with delivering that care changes a lot as well. Do you think that's true?
I do, and I think this is one of the things that maybe differentiates our healthcare system compared to other systems when considering technology fixes for some of the challenges. Technology is, hugely profitable and hugely advantageous in a lot of different places. And even taking blockchain as a technology, it's advanced in fintech considerably, even beyond cryptocurrency and some of the administrative applications that it's allowed for validating purchases and validating cross-country remittance of money in a faster way. In supply chain, it's matured very quickly because of the value that it can bring. In healthcare, advancing the use of a technology is a more complicated picture. It's a multi-sided system, and the system itself has different dimensionalities to it, not just in the data, but in the different types of quality of data, the different qualities needed for an insurance claim versus a clinical decision versus the research that underlies advancing clinical care. All of these require the same data, and yet each has a different quality threshold. So looking at it becomes very, very different in healthcare than in other places. So I think that's one of the reasons moving to that patient centricity has been a challenge, because you're solving not just technical problems, you're solving multi-party business problems. And you're trying to figure out the right incentivization structure for the patients, for the doctors, for the payer providers, for the pharmacies. All of these groups have their ways of doing things. And it, for better or for worse, that's the status quo. Changing that between just two of the parties with a simple application might be possible, but it's going to have repercussions in the other areas, or maybe limitations to it because of some regulatory components, say like HIPAA. So figuring out how to change the system as a whole is a more complex challenge, but it has a huge value to it. We like to say that the changes that blockchain and Web3 have brought to other industries are really just the tip of the iceberg, and that the complexities and costs in healthcare actually point to A, more challenging to find the solution, but B, much more value, both on a monetary business level, but also on a health and quality of life and well-being level. And I think that's very important as well.
Okay, so I can well understand how a blockchain ledger that multiple parties have access to, various different professionals in the healthcare industry or pharmacists or whatever, that if you had a comprehensive ledger that as you interacted with the healthcare system across your entire lifespan, that situationally the right people can access the relevant portions of your record, which are ledgered, and you've got cryptography that is kind of protecting the data and making sure that it's only exposed situationally to the right people in the right situations, that would afford the healthcare system a tremendous amount of insight to improve the quality of healthcare. And that if we had these next generation electronic healthcare records that weren't kind of locked into any particular experience with any particular healthcare provider at any particular point in time, that there's a huge advantage in that. As we kind of bridge into the second part of that equation that says that we ourselves, by virtue of the actions that we take, the decisions we make, the devices that we wear, that we're actually generating data that is not only relevant to our own healthcare record and the potential quality that the system delivers to us as a person, but that data actually has value as part of a much larger corpus that the healthcare system can kind of go and mine for insight to deliver better value to much broader audiences. And that kind of brings to bear this question about, in a patient-centric world, and in the world you were talking about incentivizing behaviors, that the patient themselves, the individual, has a certain set of behaviors that are part of that incentivization scheme. And so can you imagine systems where we find ways of, rewarding people for doing certain things or allowing certain kinds of information to be collected and then leveraged by commercial companies or hospitals for other purposes?
We are not only imagining that, we are trying to set up the framework for that in what we call an Equidium exchange, which will allow individuals to maintain control and access of their own information. And when they consent to do so, allow, say, a pharma company to access that information, not take all of the data, but bounce queries, bounce algorithms off of that data. And that can be done not only in a retrospective sense, but it can be done in a prospective sense, a future sense. So someone could essentially say, I would like to have patients who will make data available about individuals with this inclusion and this exclusion criteria and these types of devices. And I would like 3 years of that data for both a control group and a group taking our product, whether that's a device or a pharma product. That's essentially what's done now in a research study. And pharma spends a large amount of money to bring people in for research study and collect their own data. And I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of the cost of clinical research for pharma is recruitment and retention of patients. Well, what if the patients are involved and being compensated? That data would be more high quality because you knew where it came from, you knew the provenance of that data, rather than a lot of times data that's purchased de-identified off of a hospital system to get the study started. That data would be something that the pharma company could describe beforehand, and that data would be something that allowed for much more fine-grained use if it's consented. The de-identification of data strips a lot of the value out of it for secondary research, for follow-up studies, and by having that consentedness and patient empoweredness involved, you allow for a much more robust and useful data set. And of course, that empowerment comes from incentivization. But that incentivization can come in many different forms. Obviously, compensation from a monetary equivalent form is a standard method of compensating an individual, incentivizing them. But if you look at the history of and the literature about incentivization in healthcare, there's other incentives people have. They want to get better. They want to be healthier. They want to know more about themselves. This is why people send a lot of information to 23andMe and just give it away. They would like to be able to contribute to the betterment of humanity. A lot of the work we do with an early focus of our program on veterans looks at how you can help veterans, and veterans have a tendency to want to contribute back information that will help their community. And so figuring out what incentivizes individuals is something important. Being able to use machine learning to set up personal incentivization structures within that system will make it even more valuable than a one-size-fits-all incentivization. So that's somewhere where we think things are going, and we're trying to create a structure to allow them to happen. But you're right, that personal empowerment and personal contribution by the patient allows that patient to give better quality data and get back some sort of better quality information about themselves.
It's just that the world that you're describing is in many ways quite radically different than the one that we are living in today, or that we certainly have been living in for the last 30, 40 years. And I think it's very exciting that we're going to see all kinds of breakthroughs and much greater efficiency, and that data becomes an incredibly valuable resource that to date we have been underexploiting. And so I'm personally just over the moon excited about the potential of the intersection of these Web3 technologies with the healthcare space. The last question I wanted to ask you, and thank you so much for your time. This has been really interesting. But the last question that I wanted to ask you was why? I mean, with all this potential, it's sitting there, the technology is available. Why has the healthcare industry been such a laggard? Why is it so difficult to adopt these new technologies and bring what a lot of us think is obvious value to the marketplace tomorrow? Why is it such a difficult industry to, innovate in the information technology space?
That is a tough nut to crack, and there's a lot of different fingers to be pointed and do get pointed. I don't like to finger point. I like to problem solve. But it really is the case that the technology that has advanced many other industries and can advance health and life sciences and technology in health tech is somewhat limited in its approach because it's had such a successful model through the 90s and the past 2 decades since in how it approaches from an investment standpoint, from a business standpoint, looking for product market fit, using an agile methodology, creating a product and then marketing it to the users and shaping the users around the product. Whereas in health tech, because of limitations from a regulatory perspective, limitations from a clinical validation perspective, you can't pretend something works. It either works and there is evidence for it, or there is evidence that it does not, and then you do not use it. Something, if you've ever spent time working from bench to bedside and what goes into a clinical practice guideline, that 17-year span, which can be shortened significantly with the right applications of technology, isn't completely superfluous. It's there for a reason, for the safeguards and checks and balances, so that we don't get whatever hot ticket of the day is just working its way in as some new tool, and then it turns out, oops, we shouldn't have been using that. That doesn't help people. Creating new video games or creating new things that people like to use versus things that improve a problem is the different marketing and different business value that has to be looked at in healthcare. And so the path is much more circuitous, but the entire funding stream and the entire approach of technology has been successful with a different path, and I think continues to run off the same short cliff. I've been able to see it in the 5 years since I left academia and federal government and entered the tech world. I think what's necessary is thinking bigger. We're not trying to make faster cars, or even going back to the Henry Ford, faster horses, which is what everybody seems to think the product market fit is in health tech. We're trying to make a plane that takes off the ground. We're trying to do something transformational, and you cannot do that in incrementalism. You can't just stick some wings on a car and think it's going to fly. You have to have the right type of structure for a different type of vehicle. And that's what I think we need in healthcare. And we're getting there. There's a lot of pockets of it in the startup community, in the existent legacy community, but there's a lot of barriers to them moving differently, both from a funding perspective, especially for the startups, also from a bureaucratic and authorization standpoint in the pockets of true innovation that I've seen in some of the legacy systems. They're restricted by the other parts of their organization. And so figuring out how to get past that is key. Figuring out how to do that while staying regulatorily compliant. I think that's done through showing the regulators the value of the technology. If I can allow an institutional review board that governs research to see in real time, transparently, how data is being collected and where it's coming from, versus requiring a self-reported audit twice a year, they see the value in it for them. It's cheaper, it's easier, and it's better. And so we have to bring the regulators into it, bring them in a way that empowers them, but also think of different business models and not simply a technical approach. And that really is the key, I think.
Well, I just can't wait to see what happens to this industry as artificial intelligence and IoT and blockchain technologies and some of the new visualization technologies and the composability and modularity of the Web3 platform, as they kind of impact the industry. It's going to be just so interesting to watch how it evolves and changes. And I think there's so much need for change in that industry. So I'm delighted that Equidium and yourself and your compatriots and colleagues are working on this problem. And there is a very vital and active ecosystem of innovators and startup companies that are tackling this problem. Thank you, Sean, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find research on this and other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope you will join us for the next episode of W3B Talks.